Hurricane Ida rocked the Gulf Coast last month, making landfall in New Orleans and causing significant damage to the infrastructure that supports the United States soy and grain export business. It damaged at least one major terminal and left several without power for a number of weeks. Welcome to Feedstuffs in Focus, our podcast taking a deeper look at big issues in the livestock, poultry, grain, and feed industries. I'm your host, Andy Vance. Thanks for joining us. In this episode, we talk with frequent guest Mike Steenhoek of the Soy Transportation Coalition and take a look at how badly Ida hurt trade at the Gulf, what damage is yet to be repaired at the terminals, and what lessons the industry might take away from this latest weather-related challenge to our infrastructure. This episode is sponsored by Novus International Incorporated, a leader in dairy, poultry, and swine nutrition solutions driven by science. Novus's products and services look at the whole animal, focusing on productivity and well-being in order to feed the world affordable and wholesome food. One of the things that the U.S. Agriculture industry has long relied on is as a competitive advantage is our inland waterway system and just generally our infrastructure advantages, roads, bridges, locks, dams, etc. But as you and I have talked over the past year, we can't rest on those laurels. There are a lot of things that need to happen to keep our aging infrastructure in good shape. And I think the situation with Hurricane Ida is maybe a good, object lesson as to why that's the case. Because with the hurricane, we have some real issues related to infrastructure. Would you give us an update on what Hurricane Ida did relative to moving soybeans and other ag commodities into the export market?
Hurricane Ida was clearly a reminder of the truth that what happens down there impacts what happens up here. And what happens up here does have impact on what happens down there. There's a real strong linkage between the preeminent soybean grain growing regions of this country and the lower Mississippi River near New Orleans. It's the number one launching point for both soybeans and corn. 61% of soybean exports, 58% of corn exports leave from those export facilities along that lower stretch of the Mississippi River. So when you have a major storm like a Hurricane Ida emerge and impose itself, it certainly deserves attention. And one of the big takeaways from Ida was how pervasive and seismic the power outage was to that area. It was a very violent storm, 150-mile-an-hour sustained winds. That's quite a punch. And so what we're continuing to see, fortunately, the shipping channel has been reopened. There was a number of concerns about submerged barges that had become unmoored or untethered from their staging areas, sediment buildup in the channel. That has been largely addressed. There are some restrictions, but the channel is open. What we're really continuing to monitor is this power restoration question. Most of the city of New Orleans has had power restored. Most of the populated areas have. But it's still looking like another 2, maybe even 3 weeks for some of the outlying areas in southern Louisiana before they have full power restoration. And that includes some of our export facilities. So that's really number one. And then number two is there is one particular facility that did incur some more significant damage to the facility itself, not just power loss, but damage to the facility itself. And that's a Cargill facility about 30 miles northwest of New Orleans. And we're happy that the other facilities, it does appear that they escaped any kind of major damage, but having one of those facilities down for a period of time. And, the $1 million question is how long it'll take to make those repairs. Will it be weeks or will it be months? But, as we have our export program that will be operating at full throttle over the next month plus, we obviously want to make sure our transportation system is operating on all cylinders. So that clearly is a concern of ours and something we'll be monitoring moving forward.
The thing with the power grid is interesting because I think a lot of times when we talk about infrastructure, conversations you and I had, we're talking about, the waterway, the shipping channel itself, or we're talking about, bridges with regard to our highways and the road transportation grid. But maybe we don't spend as much time talking about the power grid. And that's a I mean, I think that's a pretty vital part of our infrastructure as well, and one that we just maybe largely take for granted. Is this a good example of helping us kind of refocus that infrastructure is maybe a broader topic than a lot of times we in agriculture have thought about lately?
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point. I always try to think of it in terms of you have supply, so you've got farmers growing a bunch of soybeans and grain, and then you've got demand, whether that's domestic and international. But the infrastructure is what connects the two, and there's a lot of things that involves. Yes, it means a road, it can mean a bridge, it can mean an inland waterway system, freight rail, ports, and things like that. But it also very much depends upon having sufficient electricity to power all of that. It's about fuel delivery. It's about all of these different things that all, when you aggregate them, it provides connectivity between supply and demand. That is what one of the key functions of our infrastructure. So it's clearly something that's very important, and it's something that we need to continue to be thinking about moving forward. Is how do you build resiliency to that? There are 8 major transmission lines that feed into southern Louisiana, and all 8 of those incurred significant damage with Hurricane Ida, and that's why you had such a pervasive amount of power outages in the area. And so it's a lot of these questions that we need to be talking about is, under the term of resilience is, well, how do you make sure that you are able to evade the punch when Mother Nature swings at us? But how quickly can you recover from that punch? How quickly can you pick yourself up from that canvas? And that's something that when we continue to talk about how do we maintain and improve our infrastructure, that resilience question, that topic is increasingly being discussed and emphasized, and rightfully so.
There is some good news out of this. When we looked at the levee itself in New Orleans and the water pumping infrastructure, that withstood, as you mentioned at the top of the program, a pretty stiff punch, much different from the situation with Hurricane Katrina in 2005.
Yeah, and that's, there are not a lot of silver linings when you've got a Category 4 storm arrive at your doorstep, but I do think it was a real vivid reiteration of, I think, which is an important truth, and that is the time to invest in resiliency is before the catastrophe, not after the catastrophe. Now, with the levee system and the pumping apparatus, that was about a $14 billion investment in the New Orleans area. That was actually after Hurricane Katrina, because we clearly saw how exposed that part of the country is to those kind of storms. So it was actually after Hurricane Katrina. But the fact that now that we had built it, that city was much better positioned to withstand such a violent storm than it was 16 years ago when Hurricane Katrina arrived. And so, again, there's not a lot we can do about Mother Nature, but there's a whole lot we can do about how we're able to withstand Mother Nature. And this is a really good example. And I hope policymakers really are thoughtful about this and really take this to heart. Clearly, there has been and continues to be some real suffering due to Hurricane Ida, but it pales in comparison to what we witnessed with Hurricane Katrina. You had, the storms were similar, but they had some significant differences as well. But, one of the key differences is because we had invested in that community, it was better able to withstand it, and how much human suffering was mitigated because of that investment.
Let's pull back a little bit and look at some of the other specific issues to Hurricane Ida, looking at all of the major players in the region, the companies that are there doing business. What's the latest on who's back up and running and where there are additional improvements, or I shouldn't say improvements, repairs that need to be made to the major terminals there at the Gulf?
Yeah, the big one is this Cargill facility 30 miles northwest of New Orleans with their conveyor system that's used for loading ships. It's clear when you see the images that that is not a quick fix. But again, the question is will that take weeks or will that take months? And this time of the year, fortunately, there's not a lot of soybeans that are exported out of the Gulf. This is not the time of the year where the U.S. soybean export spigot is turned on. It's mostly the South American spigot that's turned on. But when our harvest comes online in a very short period of time, that's when the U.S. spigot gets turned on. And easily in the month of October, November, you can see 55 million bushels of soybeans get exported out of the Gulf region compared to what we're seeing now, about 10 million bushels. So you can easily see a 5 times increase in exports. So that's really the concern that we have moving forward, is how quickly that particular facility will get back up and running. But then also things like power restoration. We did see a ship get loaded full of grain earlier this week near Baton Rouge. That's certainly good news. But it's the other facilities that did suffer power outages that are still struggling to get back up and running. And again, hopefully it's just a matter of 1, 2, maybe 3 weeks. That'll be very important, again, before the harvest comes online and our export program really kicks into high gear. We've got some good news that farmers are going to produce a pretty healthy crop, and we've got continued demand for that crop. But again, you have to have connectivity between supply and demand, and so you want to make sure that area of the country is back up and running as much as possible.
I want to shift gears entirely in a couple minutes that we have left with you, Mike. Earlier in the year, you and I touched base on the infrastructure bill that the administration's has moved forward, Congress has taken up. Now, could you give us a quick update on where that policy and legislation are in the process and prospects for getting some movement and I guess getting a deal done there?
Yeah, I mean, we were pleased to see the Senate, by a bipartisan vote, pass the infrastructure bill in early August. It clearly is an imperfect piece of legislation. We all know that, but we do think there are a number of elements of that legislation that, if enacted, would enhance the transportation system that agriculture and other industries rely on. So that's something that we were pleased to see overall. Really, the arena is now the House of Representatives, and there's clearly tension within the Democratic caucus between the moderates, who want to see a vote more exclusively on infrastructure, more focused on infrastructure. And I'm talking about the infrastructure has become a pretty elastic term as of late. But what most Americans regard as infrastructure is things like transportation infrastructure, roads, bridges, et cetera, and also things like broadband, rural broadband, the electricity grid, drinking water, those kind of things. Most Americans regard that as infrastructure, and the moderates would like to see a vote just on that particular package and not make it so attached at the hip with the more controversial $3.5 trillion budget reconciliation measure. And so, but then the progressives don't want to yield on that. They want them to be inextricably linked. So that's the real question right now. I think my wager is on something emerging from the House of Representatives. The infrastructure, it's clearly a priority of the president. I would venture to predict that we will see something passed this year that's similar to what was passed out of the Senate. But again, it's a very dynamic environment in Washington, D.C. right now.
You hit the crux of it, right? What is infrastructure? You and I were talking off the air before the interview that I've been in this business 20 plus years now, and I swear we were talking about rural broadband day one, and in some ways it doesn't feel like we've made very much progress. We have, but in some ways it doesn't, just for all of the work that seems to be that needs to be done yet. Do you foresee this topic of this definition of infrastructure continuing to expand, and should it, or do we need to stay focused on sort of the bricks and mortar type infrastructure, if you will, roads, bridges, locks, dams, et cetera?
No, I think so. And I think when you start deviating from that, then you lose support from the American people. You have less of a prospect for a bipartisan win. The prefix infra means below. And then so you put below structure. That's what infrastructure is. So it's kind of the framework or the foundation upon which a lot of industries can benefit from and utilize. But when you start kind of deviating from that and start making it more targeted, I'm trying to benefit a particular activity or a particular industry. Even if you think it has merit, you start to reduce the likelihood of getting that more bipartisan win. Whereas when you look at roads and bridges and ports and those kind of things, benefit can be accrued to all industries, all taxpayers. And that's when you start having more agreement among the American people. And, clearly we're in a period right now where there's not a lot of agreement on even what the color of the sky is in Washington, D.C., or whether apple pie is delicious. It's hard to get a consensus on anything. But, we do have an opportunity to get something done on infrastructure because there's still quite a bit of agreement on kind of that core infrastructure, like transportation, like electricity, like drinking water, those kind of things that both Republicans and Democrats agree is by and large a legitimate exercise of the government. It's a legitimate activity of the government. So that's always been our long hope is let's keep it focused on that. There's a bipartisan win that's right on the table. And we just hope both Republicans and Democrats pull up their chair, sit at that table and actually get it done. And then if there's a lot of other issues that deserve debate, then debate those things. But let's not make infrastructure where there is bipartisan support contingent upon these more controversial measures.
Thanks to our sponsor for this episode, Novus International Incorporated, a leader in dairy, poultry, and swine nutrition solutions driven by science. Novus's products and services look at the whole animal, focusing on productivity and well-being in order to feed the world affordable and wholesome food. My thanks to Mike Steenhoek for his insights into the aftermath of Hurricane Ida, as well as for an update on the infrastructure bill in Washington and what we can expect in the coming weeks. I'm Andy Vance, and you've been listening to Feedstuffs in Focus. Thanks for joining us today. If you want to hear more conversations about some of the big issues affecting the livestock, poultry, grain, and feed industries, subscribe to this podcast on your favorite platforms, including Apple and Google, or visit our website, feedstuffs.com, for future episodes. Until next time, have a great day, and thanks for listening.